moving on to our next chapter, living, non-living and dead. We see variety of organisms, variety of things that are present in our environment. How do we differentiate them as what is living and what is non-living or what is dead? So there must be some characteristics or there must be some features that are present in living organisms, but they are absent in non-living organisms, and they are also absent in dead organisms. So how do we differentiate all these terms? Let us first know what is living, what is non-living and what is dead. Living refers to anything such as plants and animals that has life. Anything that has life is known as living. Plants and animals, they come under the category of the living organisms. These living organisms, they are born, they live for some time. After what time? They just die and they perish. So plants and animals, they are termed as living organisms. And what are non-living organisms? Non-living organisms, they have no lifespan at all. They have no lifespan. So they were never living. They have no lifespan. They were never living, so they are non-living things. Dead organisms are those organisms that were once living, but after few time they showed no traces of life. Once living, at one time they were living, but after some time later they show no traces of life. So the best example of dead organism is a dry piece of bone which was once of a living organism, but now it is non-living. Dry piece of bone or a piece of leather or even a piece of wood which was a part of plant which was living, but now it is non-living. So wood was a part of plant which was living, but now it is non-living because it shows no traces of life. So we classify them as under a dead organism. Non-living organisms, they never had any lifespan, such as glass or any other utensils or motor car or anything which never had a life. So they are non-living. And living, such as plants and animals. So this is all we talked about living, non-living and dead. But how do we come to differentiate between what is living and what is non-living? There must be some features that are present in living organisms, but they are not present in non-living organisms. So let us discuss each and every feature which is present in the living organisms. So the basic features of living organisms are, the first feature is that they must possess growth. Living organisms must grow. Growth means deposition of something, whether internally or externally, it is termed as growth. So growth must occur in human beings or in plants or in animals. So if growth occurs, we call them as living organism. The second most important point is reproduction. All living organisms, they must have ability or capacity to reproduce. The third thing is metabolism. Metabolism is a biological process which occurs in the body. So metabolism is also one of the characteristic feature of all living organisms. The fourth point is cellular organization, because all living organisms are formed of cell. So cellular organization is also one of the feature of living organisms. The last characteristic feature that a living organism or a living thing must possess is consciousness. We also call consciousness as awareness. Consciousness means awareness to the surrounding environment. When any individual is aware of what is happening in the environment, he is known to be conscious or he is known to be aware of that. So this is one of the characteristic feature that a living thing has, but a non-living is not aware of what is happening in the environment. So these are the 5 main features of a living organism. Out of these 5 features, the first 2 features are not the defining characteristics of living organism, but these characteristics are the defining feature. These characteristics are the defining feature. What do you mean by defining feature? Defining feature is that feature which has no exceptions. So these characteristics has no exceptions. However, growth and reproduction are not the defining features. That means they have some exceptions. There are some organisms which has growth, which has ability to reproduce, but they are not living. So there are few exceptions under growth and reproduction. That's why we don't call these features as the defining features, but metabolism, cellular organization and consciousness, they are the defining features because there is no exception. If any individual or any organism possesses these three characteristics, that means that yes, it is a living organism and there is no such exception. So now let us discuss each of them in detail. The first is growth. What do you mean by growth? Growth occurs when there is overall increase in the mass. Whenever there is overall increase in the mass, we call it, yes, growth is occurring. Now, how this overall increase in mass occurs? This overall increase in mass occurs by two twin characteristics. One is by increase in size and one is by increase in the number. Now, increase in number and size means there is increase in the size as well as number of cells. Cells are the basic unit of which human beings are formed. So, whenever there will be increase in the number of cells, which occurs by cell division. Cell division results in increase in the number of cells, and also cell grows by increasing the metabolic activities, so size of cells also increases. Whenever there is increase in the size of cells or also there is increase in the number of cells, yes, growth is occurring in those cells. So this is another feature of living organism. But how the increase in the number and how increase in the size actually occurs, means how growth occurs. How growth actually occurs. Growth occurs due to a basic process which is metabolism. Now, what is metabolism? What do you mean by metabolism? Metabolism is also known as a biological reaction. It is a biological reaction, or we can call it any living reaction. This biological reaction or metabolism, it involves the living organisms or the involvement of the living biomolecules. So it is the reaction involving, or we can call it more appropriate, living reaction. It is the living reaction which involves biomolecules. Any living reaction which involves biomolecule, it is known as metabolism. So now how growth occurs, how growth is related to this metabolism. There are two main categories of this metabolism. One is anabolism and another term is known as catabolism. These both terms are exactly opposite of each other, where anabolism means building up, or anabolism is also known as constructive. It is a constructive process. It is a constructive process. Catabolism is a destructive process. We call anabolism as a building up reaction. Because building up, why? Because this is a reaction in which a complex molecule is formed from tiny small molecules, tiny small biomolecules. So anabolism is formation of complex molecule from small molecules, but catabolism is a breakdown of complex molecule into small molecules. It is the breakdown of complex molecules into small molecules. But it is the building up of complex molecule from small molecules. Now how growth occurs? Growth occurs whenever there is more formation of complex molecules and less breakdown of these complex molecules. So whenever there is increase in anabolism and there is decrease in catabolism, then growth naturally occurs. Then growth naturally occurs. There is another term which is degrowth. Another term is degrowth, which is quite opposite of this growth. In degrowth, which is also known as negative growth, what happens in that type of growth? In simple growth, anabolism reaction has a high rate and catabolism reaction has a low rate. But in degrowth or in negative growth, there is decrease in the anabolic reactions. There is decrease in the anabolic reaction, which is opposite of the growth. Decrease in the anabolism, but there is increase in catabolism. So this is known as degrowth, or this is also known as a negative growth. Now let us move on to our second characteristic feature of living organisms. The second feature is reproduction. The second feature is reproduction. Now what do you mean by reproduction? Reproduction means ability to produce offspring which are similar to the parents. Ability to produce offsprings which have characteristics that are similar to the parents. Which have characteristics that are similar to their parents. So this is what reproduction is. When any organism has ability to reproduce, we call that it is, yes, this organism is living organism. But how? Reproduction is of two types, asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is uniparental, that is, it involves only one parent. Sexual reproduction is biparental, or we can say it involves two parents, both male and female. So this is about sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, there is formation and fusion of gametes. What are gametes? Gametes are the sex cells. So formation and fusion of gametes means that it is a sexual reproduction, but in asexual reproduction there is no fusion or no formation of sex cells or gametes. No formation or no fusion of the gametes. So this is the basic difference between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So this is a characteristic. If an organism is able to reproduce, we call them living. But I told you one thing, that reproduction and growth, they are not the defining feature of any living organism. Yes, they possess something that possess some exceptions. They have some exceptions. So what is that exception? Is there any organism which is not able to reproduce but we call them non-living? No. We do not call them non-living. If there is an organism that does not have ability to reproduce, do we call them non-living? No, we don't call them non-living. We yet call them living. So this is wrong. This is not the defining feature. This means it has some exception. So what is that exception? Which is that organism which cannot reproduce? Example, infertile human couples. Human couples which are infertile, which do not have ability to reproduce. Do we call them non-living? No, we yet call them living organisms. That's why this is an exception. Mule, which is also sterile, it is not able to reproduce. Another example, sterile worker bees. These sterile worker bees, even they are not able to reproduce, but we still call them living. We don't call them non-living. So that's why reproduction is not a defining feature. Now let us move on to our third characteristic feature of living organisms.